People have read it. You figured out you married crazy, but what was the last straw that made you say, fuck it?
Money would disappear from time to time, like as soon as I had saved enough for something important. I was very young and couldn't really connect that he would do this to me, to us, when it seemed we were both working so hard toward big goals. The last straw was when another 2K stash disappeared and I wouldn't let it go. I demanded he tell me where it went, and he said, "If I don't want you to know something, you will never know."
She contacted an ex-girlfriend who we found out had breast cancer. They met for lunch and started hanging out without me knowing it. Then she tells me that her and the ex-girlfriend had worked something out where I would get back with the ex so she could be happy. And then after she passes away, we would get back together again. There was a bunch of weird stuff before that, but this one took the cake.
Ooh, this is question for me. My ex-husband was a bad man and definitely crazy. Could say so much here, but the final straw is the question asked. So, from shortly after we met, he told me he had a deceased son, and that not many people knew as he didn't like to share it. He said the child passed away age 4, and that he had had him on holidays as he wasn't really with the mother anymore, but they'd had many memories. He told me everything about this kid, his favorite toys, his hobbies, his birthday and death day, his full name including 2 middle names. He had a tattoo for his son. Pictures. Everything you'd expect, really, without demanding someone to show you cold, hard proof. We even drove 9 hours to visit his grave, but never actually went to the grave, as my ex broke down crying. In fact, when our bio child together was born, we attempted to list him as her sibling on the birth certificate, but we weren't allowed as I wasn't his mother, and there was no half siblings allowed to be listed. But there was loose threads, things that didn't make sense. It was hard to demand proof, and people don't tend to lie about deceased children, and it's a hell of an accusation. But eventually I did. Too much to explain, but this son never existed. And I spoke to the supposed mother, and she said, "Why does he keep doing this? We don't have a son dead or alive." He did eventually admit it, after trying to make a fake profile for his ex who he claimed was the mother, and tried to message me on there as her, to convince me. Didn't work. That was the last straw. Made my escape with my daughter a week later. Needed some planning. Never seen him again, thank God. Got full custody.
After hiding in the karaoke bar bathroom for 30 minutes, she came to me in tears because the guy she had been trying to cheat on me with turned her down. She was expecting sympathy. Edit. Wow, since this blew up, here is how the rest of the night went. I told her what she did was unforgivable, said goodbye to my friends, and called us an Uber home. She cried the entire way while I shared apologetic looks with the driver. Once home, I told her to sleep on the couch and that we would talk in the morning. She was still upset and told me she was going to take an Ambien to sleep. I told her to do whatever she wanted and closed the door to the bedroom. I was laying there for about 30 minutes processing how awful this was, and how I had to get out of this marriage when I sat bolt upright. She had been drinking a lot that night, and then she took a sedative. I ran out to the living room and tried to shake her awake. No response. She was still breathing, but I couldn't wake her, so I called 911. About 5 or 6 minutes later, there are 5 firefighters and 2 police in my living room, taking her vitals and loading her onto a stretcher for a trip to the ER. A firefighter looks me in the eyes and says he sees people die this way all the time. The police question me and examine me to see if there are signs of a struggle, checking my fingernails, looking for scratches on my forearms, neck, face, etc. It sucked, but the cop was actually a really nice guy and was just doing his job. Turns out the Ambien prescription was super old and from her ex-boyfriend. Awesome stuff to learn at 3 a.m. They take her to the ER for treatment. I follow the ambulance, since even though I hate what she did to me, I don't want her to die. At this point, I'm still processing the night, but also the past 4 years of marriage, and how the abuse from her built to this point. The best I can describe it as is surfacing from deep underwater. I find out she is stable and recovering. It's 5 a.m., so I go home and play with my cats and watch the sunrise. Edit 2. Thanks for the trip down memory lane, Reddit. I had honestly kind of blocked out how that night ended. I think I can look back on it okay now. It was a genuinely shitty night, but also the start of the rest of my life.
She smothered a quail to death on our back porch while I was at work and told me about it in excruciating detail when I got home. She was in vet school and described how she put her stethoscope on the bird's chest and listened to its heartbeat stop as she held its beak closed and covered the air holes. We weren't married, luckily, but damn, she was nuts. We never had a real conversation after that. I just moved out as soon as I could. She's a veterinarian now, and that really disturbs me. She smothered a quail to death on our back porch while I was at work and told me about it in excruciating detail when I got home. She was in vet school and described how she put her stethoscope on the bird's chest and listened to its heartbeat stop as she held its beak closed and covered the air holes. We weren't married, luckily, but damn, she was nuts. We never had a real conversation after that. I just moved out as soon as I could. She's a veterinarian now, and that really disturbs me.
I stayed temporarily with a friend and his GF after a breakup, where I had to suddenly move back home. I've never seen a more disgusting house apartment before or since. The cat box was literally overflowing. The kitchen was absolutely covered in trash and old food, and the fruit fly infestation was so thick you couldn't walk through the room. The garbage can in the bathroom was completely overflowing with pull-ups from their toddler. There was food and garbage covering the floor. The air literally hurt to exist in BC, of the thick smell of cat pee. You could smell their apartment from down the hall. The only room that was fairly clean was the toddler's room. Absolutely insane. He wouldn't let his GF clean either. Would absolutely lose it on her when she'd even mention it. I just did it myself a few times. He could yell at me instead if he wanted. She was the sweetest girl in the world, but very anti-conflict. I waited until he went to sleep to clean. I had to come back and stay with them twice while I tried to get back on my feet. And every time I came back, it was in the same way it had been before I cleaned. I stopped being friends with this guy LOL. Edit to answer why I didn't report them to CPS. At that point, I didn't realize that this was something that CPS should be reported to about. I was pretty young at that point, and from my experience with CPS, I thought they mainly took kids away from physically abusive parents. I spent my childhood in abusive foster homes that were worse than my abusive father. So, in my mind at the time, calling CPS was for physical abuse, and kids would very likely be put in abusive homes, which would be worse than the conditions he was in. He also spent most of his time at his dad's, which was probably why his room was mostly neat compared to the rest of the apartment. Looking back, I wish I had reported this, and while it might seem like common sense to everyone now, this was when I was really young and before everyone had instant access to the internet all the time. The poor kid definitely deserved better, and that was why I cleaned their place when I could. But if I knew then what I know now, I'd have done things differently.